So let's travel back to the early 1890s, when in fact George stopped in San Francisco en route to Australia and New Zealand. It was part of his round the world tour, and somewhere out there in the gathering, even of the evening chill, I think George is on his way, walking in the cold, on his way to speak to you, this intimate audience. He just had a big public speaking engagement at the Metropolitan Theater here in San Francisco. And I question, in these difficult times, are you ready for some big ideas? Welcome, Henry George.
500, 600 people at the Metropolitan Theater. What a astonishing evening, and so well respected and acknowledged. Hundreds of people cheering at the end of this presentation I made. And to those who, seeing the vice and misery that spring from the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, feel the possibility of a higher social state and would work for its attainment, I dedicate the next 40 minutes of your time. I'd like a few of you here on my right to stand. It was like a wave, I must say. I'd like a few of you please to stand here on my right. And as I seat you, I'd like you, those in the middle, to stand. Please stand. And now sit, and you sit as my left hand stands, please. And now let's go back the other direction. Sit. And the middle section, please rise. And now the center section, sit as the right section rises. Thank you, and you may be seated. Thank you. It was like a wave filling me with courage to speak to you tonight. For those seeing the vice and misery that spring from the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, and feel the possibility of a higher social state, and would work for its attainment, I dedicate the next 40 minutes. For the younger members here today, library associates, I assume, who've been sent here by Charles Terrell, the head of the Board of Trustees. And over here, yes, there's George Rogers, a former member of the board, and John Vance, Cheney, the current librarian. I thank you for inviting me here, but I'd like to say a few words to the younger members of the staff here at the library. You may be wondering why a speaker of some renown, myself, should be invited to this chapel, you might say, of the library for a personal talk. Well, as you may probably not know, I in fact was the first secretary of the San Francisco Library. George Rogers and I were working together intimately. He was first president. Thank you, George. And I believe it was at Dashaway Hall. Yes, Dashaway Hall, where we formed the library. Just 6,000 volumes, not circulating. As now we find ourselves in this great edifice, part of the San Francisco City Hall, and with over 35,000 volumes now circulating in a building which has gas heat, which I understand may soon be replaced by electric power to safeguard the integrity of the volumes. I'm just thrilled to be back here and to address you all. I was married here in San Francisco. I had each of my 4 children born here in San Francisco. I worked as a typesetter. So yes, indeed, I am an intimate of San Francisco history. But I'd like you to reflect on some of the other members of the audience. I see Hubert Bancroft, who has recently begun publication of a great volume of California history. I know I recognized, there's Ina Coolbrith, and John Muir. John Muir, you've written, I believe I've only seen in manuscript form, your history of the mountains of California, including your study of the glacier formations there. And we may come back to that later in this talk. There's Ambrose Bierce. I'm truly flattered by all those who are here this evening. But there is another sort of writing beyond the more philosophical, should we say, larger writing of these men I've just mentioned, and I should leave out the women. Kate Kennedy, who is ill. I'm flattered most of all by your presence here, having made a trip across the bay by ferry to, in your illness to hear me this evening. Thank you so much for coming. She has in manuscript a text, The Foolish Pigeons of Dr. Paley, and I can recommend that if it ever comes to publication. Edward Taylor. Edward Taylor, a man I could commend to you as a future mayor, if circumstance should provide. Here's a man who is even now the head of the Hastings Law College and has headed up some of the medical work here in education in San Francisco, a poet in his own right. But beyond these larger philosophical works, there's another sort of writing, current events, the sort that newspapermen take up. And it's to that I would like to speak with you this evening concerning. Men such as, I don't think James Clatchy is in the hall, but James Clatchy of the Bee, who gave me my first opportunity to editorialize in San Francisco, was just that sort of fellow who, taking up events of the day and showing a mirror to society, provided the prompt for these other men who have more deeply sounded the human condition. You already know what I'm about, what I spoke about at Metropolitan Hall over on Montgomery Street. I stand for land for the people. You know that I don't need to go into great detail, but there is, even amongst the James McClatchys of the world, these editorial men, a sense that land doesn't play a prominent role in today's economy. But I wonder, where would these editorials, these editors be if there were no land? Would they hold themselves up by straps? Would they take a balloon up into the air? And what holds the air up but the earth underneath it? My young daughter, who's now taking a geography class, came to me just a few weeks ago and said, "Papa, here in this book, it says something about the surface of the earth. I wonder what that is." I took her over to the window and said, "Why not look out in the backyard? There's the surface of the earth." And she said, "Well, I never thought of that's the surface of the earth." Yes, land is underneath us, whether we're farmers or whether we are manufacturers, whether we are working men, whether we are editors. You know that I stand for not just the land being the people's, but the land being the inheritance of the entire culture. So this idea of property right really has its foundation in a single natural right, and that is the right to your own person, the right to make something, to do something, and to call that yours. As against all the world, if a man should make a house, that is his house to occupy, to sell, to give away, for that matter, to take down. That is the right of property. But what right of property can there be in land itself, except by appropriation? No one has made it. That's as foolish as if we were sailing and another were to come in a sailboat, for the first man to say, "Well, you can't come out to Alcatraz, all the water for 2 miles around it is mine." What a silly notion, an absurd notion. But that is precisely what we have done with land itself, called it ours as though it was made by one man or another. Absurd. I have also stood for the alienation of people from the land, collectively and individually, as the fulcrum upon which poverty has been generated. And an example, perhaps, will illustrate just how powerfully the ownership of land can be. Imagine a caravan traveling across a savanna, and a group of brigands espying this caravan and saying to themselves, all the food, all the material needs we could ever want are in that caravan. Let's rob them, kill them, take all that we need. And another member of the brigand says, no, it's much easier than that. Let's go forward to the next oasis And when the caravan arrives, we'll simply say, we want a tenth of all your goods in order for you to refresh yourselves at the oasis. And then this group of brigands proceeds across the savannah at each oasis, replicating this theft. By the time the caravan has arrived at its final destination, what is left? Perhaps 10% of the caravan's original goods, the shirts on their back, and a packet of food in the hands of the caravanners. That is the power of the ownership of land over another. The ability to extort the value of labor and of capital, for that matter. Imagine Robinson Crusoe when he encountered Friday, saved him from the cannibals. He was called Friday his slave, but it might have been much easier than that. All he had to do was say, yes, I will give you the vote. Yes, although you are a dark man, you can have equal rights with me. Just one thing, the island is mine, and I will take whatever portion of the timber you should harvest, perhaps 20% each time you harvest a tree will be mine, and each time you should plant a crop, 20% of that will be mine. How many of you are paying at least 20% of your rent to the landowner, huh? Yes, reflect on this and multiply that times all the millions who are here. And you also know that in addition to my stand on the universal inheritance in the land, and that poverty arises from the privatization of the value of land, you know that I stand for the socialization of land rent in order to equalize the economy, to make good the exertions of working men and working women so they might have their fair share. That is my chief message, of course. But I want to talk to you about some current events in the past here in San Francisco that launched my deep philosophical thought. And the first story I should like to recount is one having to do with the tariff. In the 1860s, towards the end of the American Civil War, I was a tariff man. And the reason was simple. There was not a sufficient population here to generate the manufacture of goods and services in California. And only with a rising population, did it seem, and only with the tariff would there be the ability to produce the goods in California that otherwise had to be shipped here. I went into a lecture while living in Sacramento as the second. That is, there was another man, I don't recall his name just now, who was speaking in favor of the tariff, and I was to speak as the second in favor of the tariff. But by the time Mr. Miller was through with his argument, I was made a free trade man. His arguments that, to ensure that we have production here in California, we should stop the arrival of goods by ship. And it occurred to me, well, that is the argument of war. In war, if we wish to actually stop or prevent goods being brought to us, we should mine the harbor, blow up the ships which are bringing all the goods that we desire. That is the object of a tariff, is to restrict trade. And the lesson I took that evening was that it is the free exchange, not the restricted change of goods and services, that is a desirable first principle. The second anecdote, current event, that I wish to share with you has to do with the ride I took in the Oakland Hills in 1868, later part of 1868. I was then living in Oakland, working at a small Catholic paper, and it was my wont to take an afternoon ride on my pony up into the Oakland Hills. And on one of these occasions, I came to a spring box, a water box for the purpose of refreshing the teamsters' horses as they were coming up or going down the hills. I stopped my own pony there to refresh itself, and just then a teamster arrived, coming down the hill towards Oakland. He stopped to have his horses refreshed, and for want of anything better to say, I asked him what land was selling for just there, and he said, well, around here, $5 an acre. But if you travel 2 hills over, and he pointed to some cows that were so far away they looked like mice, he said, if you'll go there, there's a man selling land at $1,000 an acre. Well, why was that? Well, there's a railroad coming through that pass from Sacramento, the completion and extension of the Transcontinental Railroad. Must have been 1869, as I think of it, with the completion of the railroad in that year. And it came as just a flash into mind that here was the explanation for the great division of society, as though by a wedge permanently setting those who don't have land against those who have possession of land. That is, just as society organizes itself, brings in the telegraph, brings in the railroad, paves roads, provides a library, a museum, just there the value of land rises. And those who are already in possession can exact Caruso's exaction from Friday of each man and woman who subsequently should arrive and seek his opportunity. The third story I wish to share with you, the third current event, has to do with an instance of the telegraph. This was in 1868. I was then working for a small paper here in San Francisco, which did not yet have connection with the Associated Press telegraphic news wire service. The large papers in town had monopolized that access to the Western Union-born Associated Press wire service. And as the telegraphic news brought attention and high subscription to those papers which were already members of that association here in San Francisco, it was desirable, in fact it was necessary to sustain a paper to have access to the telegraphic news. I was sent east in order to petition the Associated Press, and if that not successful, to petition Western Union along its trunk telegraphic line to bring news to our smaller paper. Well, we were frozen out by the larger papers here in San Francisco, working with the Associated Press in New York City. So I must say, by some rather surreptitious means, I managed to intercept much of the telegraphic news, put it into code, and then send it again through the Western Union line. And for a short while, there were instances in which our small paper had the news even before the larger daily papers here in San Francisco. However, the ruse was at last sleuthed out, and the papers here managed to bear upon the Associated Press, which in turn bore down on the Western Union line, which again froze us out, and our paper went bankrupt, as did so many other smaller papers, all by the force of monopoly. And that is what I wish to bring to your attention here as a current event, is this matter of monopoly and the monopolization of land as I witnessed it with the railroad coming through the pass there in Oakland. The last current event story I wish to share with you, it has to do with a journal article I wrote in 1868 before the completion of the railroad, and this was what the railroad will bring us. And in that extended article in the Overland Monthly, I made the case for the benefits which the railroad would indeed bring the West Coast, and San Francisco in particular. It would bring hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of new workers. It would bring wealth. It would bring the pianos. It would bring all the goods which San Francisco and California at large could desire and did desire. But I also noted the liability of the completion of this railroad, because with the railroad would also come the yacht, and with the railroad would also come the mansion. If we compare, for instance, the circumstance of England today with a population of 25 millions in an area just 1/3 the size of California, and when we consider that that population as an aggregate has per capita wealth 7 or 8 times that of the population here in California, I ask you today, would you take your chances to settle in England or here in California? before the completion of that railroad. Before the completion of that railroad, there was land aplenty to be had. In the England of today, with its great wealth, well, if you're of the upper 10,000 or the lord of a factory, well, you might take your opportunity there. But what of the millions of mill hands? Would you be one of those mill hands of Leicestershire, living in poverty in a state that makes the past experience of the slave in this country pale? I suggest not. The peculiar characteristic of California before the completion of the railroad was its general equality of opportunity. A lawyer, a banker, a professional man from the East in the placer mines working side by side by a farmer, by a factory worker who had come from the East to California. There was a general equality. And in the cosmopolitan settlement of California, with men and women from all over the world, there was a general international flavor here, and one that was of dispersed wealth. But that wealth, just as in England, so in California, with the promotion and the arrival of technology, would simply create this division, this stratification within society. And in fact, that is what we see. Just outside the door here as I entered, a beggar asked me for $1, and I gave it to him. Was that right? I don't know. But when I left this city 10 years ago, there were periods of indigence, but for the entire population. There was not strata. What I see now, 10 years after leaving the city, is layer and layer of society, a permanent class of the poor, it appears to me. In the alleys, people sleeping on the ground, on the sidewalks. And what is the expectation? That these degraded individuals will be able to elevate themselves out of this state. My simple proposal is to restore that relationship with land and with the value of the land by taxing the annual value of the earth for communal, community, social purposes. What city, taxing its land value, would not be able to provide itself a free library, museums, public education, a pension for those in need and for the elderly? This is the vision that I wish to articulate, which I do articulate, and for those who, seeing the vice and misery of the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, feeling the possibility of a higher state and would work for its attainment, I dedicate my life, and I hope you will too. I'd like to take a few questions and answers, or provide some answers.
You experienced the boom and busts of San Francisco. You were suffering poverty yourself. Can you kind of speak to that? Because it was something that really affected your life personally.
As a matter of fact, I do speak from firsthand experience, with just the sort of experience which the beggar whom I saw outside this door would experience. But as I say, there was a difference. In my time here in San Francisco, there was just seasons of poverty for the general population. There was a general depression, but it was not an expectation that one would remain as a part of the permanent poor class. Today, as I've shared, that is precisely what I perceive. Out of my own experience, and I'll share an anecdote, at the time of the birth of my second child, Richard, we were so poor that we had no more than 25 cents, and I went out on the street on a December morning, ready to demand of whomever I found $5. That seemed to be the amount needed to pay the rent, as well as to furnish my wife, who had just given birth, with something to eat. I, upon espying the first man who looked natty enough, and perhaps I do this evening, well dressed compared to my state then, I saw a man and asked of him $5, and he asked what it was for. I told him my wife was had just finished labor, had given birth to a child, had nothing to eat. He gave it to me, but I was desperate enough to have killed him had he not given it me. And it's that experience which we see congealed because of strata into a permanent degradation with the poor today, who don't even make a feint at demanding anything more than a handout, that don't expect to be able to find their own economic liberty in the land.
I expect, sir, that you've read Karl Marx during your lifetime, and if you have, would you expound on that influence?
Karl Marx and George Wynnum, the socialist leader in the United Kingdom, and I have, not Karl Marx, but Wynnum and I have been in intimate conversation. I would describe ourselves as friends. I've read some of Karl Marx's work, and I find him to be the greatest muddlehead. His analysis presumes that there is no difference to be made in the ownership of the earth itself and all of its resources and the production of goods made out of that natural resource. That is, to own the earth is equivalent to the ownership of a factory. But I ask you, if I were to give Karl Marx all of the money and all of the capital, all of the factories, and I were to have all of the land, I would tell him to quit. I'd give him notice to leave. And I there present to you the distinction which, in failing to make, Marx's analysis fails to recognize that the ultimate rent taker is in fact the landowner, and will take everything from the capitalist just as he will take everything from the laborer.
I know a little about what you propose, but what is really unclear to me is how it contrasts both with what exists and who would own the land and how would everybody get to have a share of it.
What we propose is to leave the shell of the nut to the landowner, but to take the meat. To simply say, yes, you may, if you prefer, retain your title to the land and the title to the home that may be upon it, or the factory that may be upon it, but we will take the rent, the annual value of the land on which that factory sits, or upon which that land sits. That value will become social revenue. And here in San Francisco, I was looking at the city directory yesterday, and what I observed is that the current valuation of the land of San Francisco would generate a rent of $10 million. And the current budget of San Francisco stands at $1 million. So by this reckoning, San Francisco would have 10 times its current revenue without a tax upon labor and no tax upon the capitalist, upon the factory owner, upon the small businessman.
So the factory owner would own his factory, but he would be renting the land from
That is precisely the economic relationship. But one need not take away ownership of the land from the individual who has current title. It's simply that their property tax would be raised in such a fashion that the land value, the rent potential, would be taken away on an annual basis, while the rent, the tax on the building would be eliminated. There would be no tax on structures. We want more housing? Why tax those for putting up housing? Why tax the materials out of which apartments and homes are built? Why tax a man for, or an association of men called a business, for producing the goods that society desires? Isn't that a good? Don't we desire more clothes, less expensive food, better furniture, less expensive furniture? Why tax these goods when we can simply be taxing away the value of the land, Mother Earth, upon which we all stand and live and work? Does that satisfy?
Well, Well, I'm just extrapolating maybe into the next century when large corporations could buy up land and kind of squeeze out many different other uses that serve more public good.
Well, we could say the same of today. We have those who are buying, let's return to the railroads, which have been given 1/5 of the land area of the United States by the federal government in exchange for building the railroads, right? And these railroads elevate the price of land, and yet the railroads have been paid to build these railroads. As the land value rises, who's the beneficiary but the railroad? Charging rent for anyone who would dare to put up a building, who would dare to put up a home, who would dare to start a farm on railroad land. The idea is to return to society a value generated by society. Think for a moment, well, back to the example I provided. The railroad is built. Let's say a telegraph line is installed. And incidentally, shouldn't we have telegraph neutrality? This is one of the aims and ambitions of the single tax that we advocate for, is to disintegrate, to abolish the monopoly over information which the telegraph companies have at present, right? And it's the same over the roadways, over any naturally public utility. We wish to recover the value created by that utility. What does a tram line do to land values in San Francisco? It raises them. Imagine if there are trolley cars, buses, underground trains in San Francisco were there. They would raise the value of the land, both to the north into North Beach and out to the Mission. And yet, what do? We tax the worker. We tax the businessman for daring to create a business, use that revenue to build the railroad, raise the land values, and hand that over to the landowner. Right? Why not tax that rising value of land and use that to pay for a public railway?
How do you feel about some other issues like rights for women or rights for Chinese workers who are so exploited in San Francisco?
Two responses to be distinguished. The first, I stand for the immediate affording of the vote to women. As a matter of fact, we might, if she were a bit healthier, she might speak for herself. Kate Kennedy, speaking of her achievement in 1874, securing equal pay and equal opportunity for women. The precedent for this worldwide. Thank you, Kate. She also ran for office here in California for superintendent of public education in 1886 and was fired by the school district for daring to run for office. Well, she had to sue the school district, and the case has, as I understand it, gone to the state Supreme Court and just recently was settled in your favor. Yes. So she's been given her back pay, her back position, and her court case has set the precedent for civil service tenure across the nation. Thank you, Kate. Well, this is an exemplary model of what I stand for and endorse, is equal opportunity for women to its fullest. The matter of the Chinese in the United States and in California is more problematic. Most of this population, the Chinese population, are coming here with no intention of staying. Their expectation is that they will take what earnings they have and return to China. So I cannot, in good conscience, stand by the admission of a group of people into this country who have no intention of themselves being grounded in the land.
Mr. George, you've probably seen the effects of coal mining on those miners' lungs. What about if the air becomes so polluted with that dust that it endangers all?
Just as land values would sink in a location where aerial affluent would settle just to that extent where the original value of the land was diminished by an activity of, say, a factory, a coal factory. To that very extent, we can measure by how much we need to tax that factory endeavor in order to restore the land to its original value. Should I say that again? Yes. Let's, for example, say that a given piece of land downwind from a coal manufacturer or an ironworks should start at a par value of 100. But because of the pollution you're speaking of, should diminish and go down in value by, let's say, 30%, from 100 to 70. We can now measure via the value of the land value just how much damage has been accomplished by the coal dust. And we can charge that factory a sufficient fund to restore that land value downwind to its par value of 100. So here is a very mechanical and material way to determine the harm caused by just the circumstance you present.
Mr. Henry John, you written this book, what year you wrote the book?
Progress in Poverty you refer to? Yes.
What year did you write that book?
Well, that was completed here in San Francisco in 1879.
Okay, so what are your views about the black population here?
I was, in fact, a Democrat when I came to San Francisco, but at the outset of the Civil War, I took other side. My family in Philadelphia were indifferent to the slave issue, though they were church folk. I, on the other hand, was steadfastly opposed to any form of economic or chattel slavery and joined the Republican Party. I will say that in 1869 I left the Republican Party when it became apparent that it had become a party of special interests.
I'm just having a hard time thinking this through. So land values, the way we calculate land values is based on income capitalization, so it's directly linked to how much income you can generate based off of it, which takes into consideration public policy. So if you know as a landowner that actually you won't generate much revenue at all from your land because there's a land value tax, would that not depress the land values and generate nothing in taxes?
What it will do, did you all understand the question? The question is, the value of, put in some other words, but correct me if this doesn't present your question. The value measured in dollars of anything is its income potential. That is, what will you pay to buy something given its reward to you? You won't buy something if it doesn't give you some pleasure, if it doesn't give you a material advantage economically. So the question is, won't the taxing away of the annual rent of land depress the sale price of land?
And therefore the tax revenue to the
The tax is on the rent. It's not on the sale price. So just as a renter will continue to pay rent but doesn't have any investment in in the apartment or the land underneath it that the renter is renting, right? The rent stays high. I presume rents are still high here in San Francisco, oh, right? And yet, that rent would not disappear. The value on an annual basis of a piece of land will remain as it is. But the sale price of land will tend to go towards zero. Do you follow that? No? If I were to offer you a business, but were to tell you that all of its income were going to be taxed away, would you pay me anything to buy that business? No, because it would generate no income for you. Similarly, if I were to tell you, here's a piece of land, it generates 1/3 of your income, let's say $1,000 a year, let's just say. If I told you then that that $1,000 a year would be taxed away, what would you pay me for that piece of land? Something towards zero, right? You wouldn't pay me anything because you're already paying the rent. Why would you pay me a sale price for something that you get no reward from, right? So the sale price of land would go towards zero. Now, how this affects the money supply is astonishing. When land ceases to carry debt, because under this circumstance, if you follow, you would not have to borrow money to buy land. The sale price has gone to zero. So your investment would be wholly into the production of goods and services, providing more housing. You want more housing? Why tax housing? And at the same time, by taxing away the rental income of land, its sale price goes to zero, so money need not be borrowed to buy land. The rent of San Francisco would stay high. The sale price of land in San Francisco would go to zero. And that enormous revenue I spoke of, $10 million now in 1890, 10 times the current budget of San Francisco, would meet every public need you could imagine, I suggest. I take first timers.
I'm sorry. So let's suppose that I own a home in San Francisco under this new paradigm, and I'm perfectly satisfied with paying the rent on the land in which my home occupies. But the city planner intends to build a new tram through my neighborhood. Why would I, or actually my neighbors and I, not be more likely to organize against this new tram line in order to suppress any new development and keep our rents low?
If your object is to deprive yourself of ready transportation, that's certainly your prerogative. And if your ambition is to live in the boonies, you're certainly free to do so. Under this model, your tax would be zero if you lived out in the hinterland. The land there is worth so little. It has little rental potential. But I dare say with little rent potential and therefore public revenue, we will not be building a railroad to your neck of the woods. So yes, indeed, there will be an incentive, I suppose, by some to keep the price of land from rising, but the beauty of this proposal is that it is precisely the land rent you pay which will create the public services you desire. At present, there is not a relationship between the income taxes you pay and the services that are geographically located. It is left to the cavil of the legislature, of the governing council. But with this model, what we see is a feedback from payment of rent for land, expectation of services to be delivered. Does this begin to address your question? So it is certainly possible that there will be those who seek to prevent the improvement of their neighborhood in order to keep the rent low, but they will not be therefore getting the services that they're desirous of, we would expect. And we would expect on average that more people want a municipal rail line. We would expect that more people want a public utility, water and electricity and gas to be provided, right? If they are paying the rent, they expect the service. Well, this is precisely that model, one for the other. I can think of another example that might address your concern. In Paris today, there is a restriction upon the construction of apartments above 8 floors. Well, under the proposal, the tax proposal I advocate, restricting the ability to build up will result in somewhat comparatively lower land values than if a municipality of Paris allowed for buildings to go up to 10 or 12 floors. But it gains the aesthetic at the expense of extra revenue. That's a choice which the public should be in the position of making. That's a good circumstance for a population to be in. Do we want this aesthetic or do we want this revenue? At present, who wants the revenue is the private landowner, who will exact from you 30, 20, 40% of your income for the mere opportunity to live in San Francisco, to live in New York, where people are crowded together, 2 and 3 families to a single flat. This is a future I experience and observe in New York City today, which I am confident will 100 years from now be part of San Francisco.
There's still something very muddy in my mind about the idea of rent. Rent usually means ownership by somebody else. You're saying no, the title would still be private. So what determines the rent? If you're just looking at land value, how do you assess land value?
The problem here is terms, and I'm using in a very precise economic parlance the use of the word rent. In the field of economics, we speak of the return for labor being wages, so that even a salaried worker is receiving, in an economic frame of language, wages. It's the return for, it's the value of labor rendered. The return for capital, for factories, for tools, is typed interest. This includes also financial capital, but the return for a factory's existence, its added power to the laborer, is interest. And the return for the use of natural resources, including the land underneath San Francisco, is rent. So this word rent in economic terms refers precisely to the value of what we might call, as I understand the real estate field uses the term, location, location, location. The price one pays for location, 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 both the extraction of resources but also merely occupying location, is rent. So in a more casual use, rent has come to mean the rent for both the house and the land underneath it. But in the sense in which I'm using the word rent, rent is the value of the land underneath the building, and the building returns interest. Because we precisely want to distinguish existentially, a term which I understand only the French are using with any aplomb, the existential difference between natural resources and capital. Genuine capital does not include land. Genuine capital is that which is made by human beings out of land, but land is existentially, it's not created, a distinguishable phenomena of human experience. Does this go somewhat to... Mm-hmm. I have to depart for another short speaking engagement, but there is another who will happily take questions in the present, and that's also me. So... So if you have questions for the actor, the historian, or more contemporary questions about George's ideas, I can address those. I would like to address one particularly, and that is George's views on Chinese immigration, which, as I see it, were the most personally, they're the most problematic for me. They don't conform with his general observation and commitment and deep conviction that the entire earth is the birthright of all people, and that there's no reason why one person or group of persons should be in a position of being able to alienate anyone else from their equal right to use of the earth. His argument, and it was a consistent one, I don't say it's a persuasive one, but it was one he maintained, was that, again, that a group of folk who were willing to work at a considerably lower wage, slave wages effectively, lower than the average of wages, and that was the Chinese community moving here, was willing to work for considerably lower wages, would injure the wage scale in this instance in the United States. So he remained, again, consistently, but not persuasively for me, an advocate of restricted immigration on the part of the Chinese.
Well, I guess my main question is, how in the hell did George envision even, implementing his ideas? Because there's so many forces against it. And I think this quote here, it kind of
This is from the card which was at the front of the...
Yeah, the cards. It kind of reflects what I feel is kind of his Christian humanitarian naivete, though. It says, that which is unjust can really profit no one. That which is just can really harm no one. Well, when you think of the forces of capitalism and fascism, racism is very profitable. Wars are very profitable. That's why they're perpetrated, not out of ignorance or meanness or cruelty or whatever. It's profitable. So, would you want to comment, as a contemporary on Mr. George's?
I leave it to the dedicatory remark of George in Progress and Poverty is precisely what I repeated 3 times just so it would settle, was to those who, seeing the vice and misery that spring from the unequal distribution of wealth and privilege, feel the possibility of a higher social state and would work for its attainment. That's his dedication of Progress and Poverty. He didn't say who know they can achieve that higher social state, but who feel. He was at last a process thought sort of man, if that means anything to you. That this was a continuum, and yes, he was a Christian mystic. And the only reason to qualify that with the Christian side is the universality of the Christian church as distinguished from Judaism, which was a more local, parochial view of the human experience, that here was a chosen people. And incidentally, it's an interesting bit, I want to continue with this because it's of particular interest to me, is his attunement with the Jewish, then mostly called, and this is in the 1870s and 80s, the Hebrew community. He perceived and I can recommend to you his lecture on Moses. And although I think he took literally the existence of Moses as being a fact, what he had to say about Moses was that whether Moses existed or not, this is not George speaking. He believed that there was a historic Moses. But what's important, it seems to me, about the Hebrew Bible is not whether it happened or not. It's simply that 3,000 years ago, there were a group of people who asked themselves a question. What is our relation to land? That is the central friction that's chronicled in the Hebrew Bible. And what was peculiar about the Hebrew, the Jewish, later Jewish experience, was the affirmation by the Jewish people that God was literally king, and therefore of the land, and therefore there could not be a landlord. And their commitment and conviction to that relationship shaped their social justice advocacy. So that was a moment in human experience. It's not my perspective, it wasn't revealed religion. It was a sociologically explicable circumstance, a people who made a mistake from the point of view of what you're talking about in terms of the rise of capitalism and fascism, say. They made a mistake in saying, because God is the landlord, no human can be. They created a theological threshold that they couldn't cross back over. And this is the great contribution of Hebrew theology at last, is this assertion that the earth is the birthright of all people, essentially. Christianity took that very, at that time, more parochial look. That is, God gave this piece of land to the Jewish people. And Christianity said, it's a universal question. I'm not here as an advocate of Christianity or Judaism. I'm just saying this is the sociological power of Christianity and the sociological impress of Judaism, looking at it theologically, and how does it translate into the very human experience. And I kind of lost my way a little bit with your question, but talking to what does George stand for? George's point of view is that he has a beautiful image at the end of Progress and Poverty. He's speaking about what is the meaning of individual life. And he says, what we experience in our 70 years, or more now, good health, is like viewing the universe through a telescope. And what we see of what our life looks like to others is what they see in the sphere of the telescope. That's the shooting of a star is your life. But there's everything on this side, and there's everything on this side that you don't see. And it's that which is the possibility of a higher social state. So, yes, an idealist, but he had no doubt that this would one day come to be. That is my feeling, but I don't actually believe that. It is my feeling that we will attain that, but I don't actually believe that we will attain that. It's my feeling that we will attain that, and that's what sustained George, was this sense of what is the human being after all, but a bundle of hope. Yeah.
Are there any societies or communities that have, in contemporary times, that have put into place?
The closest we can come to an example at scale is Hong Kong. When England took possession by force of a portion of China, the land was not owned by individuals. It was crown land. It was, in the real sense, the sovereign's land, public land. And so, not for moral reasons, but for efficiency reasons, England asked itself, well, how will we generate revenue to build the roads and build the port? And they said, well, since it's crown land, let's charge rent to everyone who's going to use it. And the result was, for the first 50 years of Hong Kong's existence, there was no tax on work. There was no sales tax. And it was the most dynamic economy in the world. That's not necessarily a proof, but it suggests that if the rent you have to pay anyway, all of you are paying what I mean by, in this economic sense, rent. You're paying for location, location, location. Yes? Is there anyone who's not paying for location, location, location? No, absolutely not. You're all paying for that. George simply said, why leave that location, location, location value with the landowner? Why shouldn't that come back to society to pay for all the goods you want? And yet, San Francisco complains about high rents. Well, George's response would have been, the high rents are good. Socialize all that land value, and you're going to be paying for Muni. And you will be paying for the museum. And you will be paying for the takeover of PG&E, if that's what you want. And you'll be paying for universal health care. And he speaks just that way. He speaks of, this is how, why not have pensions? Why not pay off those who, not pay off, but pay the livelihood of those who are incapable of meeting themselves their material needs? Why wouldn't you do this? Instead, month after month, each and every one of us in this room is paying part of the earth's value to an individual, or an individual entity. It may be a corporation. And George's argument, why are you doing that? That's absurd. You've walked out of Eden, to use his phrase. You've walked out of Eden, and that angel with the sword who guards the entrance back to Eden is the landowner. And you're not allowed back in, and you wonder why you're poor. And you wonder why you can't have public schools that are well funded enough, that we have to have dozens and dozens of private high schools in this city serving an elite portion of the population. Why should public education be so poorly funded that it's, again, marginalized? Well, George's response was clear, because you're paying over all this value to those who can then afford to go to these private schools. Dianne Feinstein, 6th wealthiest member of Congress. Yes. Nancy Pelosi, 13th wealthiest member of Congress. Where does this wealth come from? Real estate. All the people that receive social programs in the Mission District because of Nancy Pelosi's social advocacy are in the next moment paying her rent. Maybe not directly, but those who are supporting her. I'm not attacking particularly, in fact, these two. I'm just using them as an example. You may know that at 555 California, which is the former Bank of America building, the big brown building, who owns that building and the land underneath it? Donald Trump. You can call him what you will, but he's collecting $48 million a year from you. I mean, not you particularly, but from San Francisco. Yeah. This is what Henry George would say, if you're feeling uncomfortable, I don't know, as our host in this public
Don't
institution.
attack Nancy Pelosi right now.
Okay.
So the most important thing you're saying that George was saying is the system.
It's a systemic issue. He was not about attacking for its sake individuals. This is not what he was going about. But he was saying institutionally, look a little deeper.
Karl Marx was talking about confiscating the land. And the difference between George was not confiscating the land, it was changing the system of distribution.
Collecting the rent. Karl Marx did not call, incidentally, he did not call for the collection of rent in this sense in which I've been using it. He said there should simply be an ownership and we should all get together and decide how we want to use the land, but not what are you going to do with this community-generated value of land. And this is what George was arguing, is that you can, in fact, measure the existence. This is for the libertarians of you out there. What George argued is that for the libertarians who say there is no such thing as community, there's only contracts between individuals, that the proof that there is community is the fact that you're paying for location, location, location. That is community, is the price you're paying to be wherever you choose to be. Yeah, question?
Would George have reason to develop Prop 13?
What would he think of Prop 13?
Yeah, and what framework would you reason about?
Well, I could answer for myself, and I think that's pretty nearly too what George would say. My take on it would be he would say, why tax the buildings? So he would have approved of that aspect of Proposition 13. I'll explain that to some guests who have no knowledge of Proposition 13, acquaintance, friends of mine. It's a tax which freezes the property tax at the time of purchase, right? But it's a tax, as the conventional property tax is, on both land value as well as the building value. And George would have said, get rid of this tax on the buildings, but have the current market rent of land collected as public revenue. So he would have been robustly opposed to Prop 13's land domain aspect, rather, and supportive probably of the suppression of the tax on the buildings. Pennsylvania, I'm going to keep my remarks to 2 more minutes and then we'll break. Pennsylvania in 1913 passed legislation because of George's advocacy that cities could choose to have what's called a split rate roll. That is, they could tax buildings at one rate and land at another. And this legislation was passed precisely so that land could be taxed heavily and buildings could be taxed at a lower rate. Now, it was by no means George's tax. That is, let's tax 95% of the annual value of location, location, location. That's what George was calling for. Leaving that 5% so that landowners would get that 5% so that the government wouldn't take over the land, because he was not in favor of having a Politburo, an elite group of politicians determining how to use land. He wanted the market to say, this is how land will be used. Let's give the collection of the rent reward of about 5%, say, to the landowners. The property tax in Pennsylvania was what's called revenue neutral. That is, if the property tax in Pennsylvania was earning, let's say, $100 on a particular piece of real estate, the $100 would remain the same, but instead of that revenue coming from the tax on both equally, it would come from the land. And this does have an effect. I know you're not tax junkies the way I am, and you don't look at the effect of taxation, but it makes a difference what you tax. If I tax your income at a certain point high enough, you'll stop working. But if I tax away the rent, the land value, the income from land of a landowner, the land won't go out of existence. I can tax work out of existence, or a factory right out of existence by taxing it so heavily that people say, I don't want to engage in that activity any longer. But land will remain whether you collect all of its rent or not. Should the rent go to a private party or to the society? And George said, it goes to society. We're done. I happily will meet with you out front. When's the library open to?
I just want to make one.
Oh, please.
We have one more program
Yes.
this week, Progress to Poverty. There's flyers around if you're interested in that.
Yep.
And then, thank you so much.
Oh. Thank you.
I'll start kicking you out in half an hour, so stay and talk or go upstairs and look at.
I'll meet you, if you have some questions, we'll meet outside the lobby, but they want to shut down the show here. And incidentally, I do want to say one last remark about the photo. It's true. I believe it was this side, first of all, that was the public library in the building which stood on this site as City Hall up through 1906. And the 06 quake resulted in City Hall moving to where it now stands. So it's kind of this wonderful arc of history that the library is standing precisely where it did prior to the 1906 earthquake, but in a different building. So that's why this photograph is. All right. Very good.